Maine Army National Guard training area in Woodville was named in honor of two Passamaquoddy Nation World War I heroes. Will Wagner was there today for the dedication.
Those from the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Maine Army National Guard delivered remarks as the training site was dedicated to PFC Charles Lola and Samuel J. Dana for their acts of bravery 107 years ago.
We're coming here to honor the service and sacrifice of two really brave Maine Army National Guard soldiers and members of the Passamaquoddy Nation, one who sacrificed his life, the other was wounded on the fields of France in order to save their friends, their comrades, their fellow Mainers in a really, really difficult situation.
Through research, more details about that day were revealed.
Through additional research and through finding an eyewitness account, not only were they engaged and involved, they were right at the center of it. And in fact, that they disobeyed a direct order to abandon their forward post, staged through acts of incredible valor and heroism, stuck to their post, literally stuck to their guns, and through their actions saved so many of their comrades, saved so many families in Maine from having really horrible news coming to their doors.
Family members also spoke at the dedication.
As a child, Seraphine Lola, Charles' younger sister, saw him get on a train at Zibayak and go to war. That was the last time she saw him as the train pulled away. We often asked her about him, and just the tears in her eyes and the touching of her heart was enough to tell us what an honor it was he did over there.
Those from the Maine Army National Guard say those coming to train will learn their stories far into the future.
Soldiers from the Maine National Guard will come here over the coming decades to train in marksmanship and train in all their soldier skills. And so it's the emulating the actions of Lola and Dana and learning their story of selfless sacrifice is going to help them not just train their skills, but train their spirit and their minds as well.
Will Wagner, WABI News, Woodville.